The night shift in a Texas ICU had a very specific kind of quiet. Not peaceful, not truly silent. More like a low, constant murmur that wrapped itself around the staff and patients and never completely went away. Monitors beeped in soft, steady rhythms. Ventilators sighed and exhaled. IV pumps clicked. Air vents hummed. Somewhere down the hall, ice rattled in a plastic cup. She had been a night shift ICU nurse in this hospital for almost 5 years, long enough for that soundscape to sink into her bones, long enough to know which alarms could wait a few seconds and which meant you dropped everything and ran, long enough to recognize, without even looking up, when the entire Unit's energy changed. The day shift nurses called her the Calm One. The respiratory therapist joked that she had code blue resting heart rate. In reality, she wasn't fearless. She just knew fear didn't help in a room full of crashing patients. You stabilized, you documented, you handed families bad news in a steady voice. Later, you took your shaking hands to the break room and tried not to think about it too much. Tonight had started like any other. The ICU sat on the 4th floor of a mid-sized hospital in Texas. Long, narrow hallways lined with heavy doors and glass windows. Every room wired into the central monitoring system. The walls were some neutral color that had once been warm, but now just looked tired under fluorescent light. Outside, a thunderstorm had rolled through just before sunset, leaving the world damp and heavy, the sky still flickering with distant lightning. Her assignment was 4 patients, 2 on ventilators, 1 septic hanging on by a thread, 1 older woman recovering from a surgery that had gone more complicated than expected. She'd done her first assessments, checked labs, adjusted drips, and written the initial notes that would follow each patient through the night. By 2:30 a.m., the unit had slipped into its usual graveyard rhythm. Families were gone. The cafeteria downstairs was dark. The ED on the 1st floor would still be buzzing, but up here, under dimmed corridor lights, it felt like another world. She sat at the nurse's station, charting by the glow of her screen. The big digital clock above the unit map read 2:58 a.m. She'd just taken a sip of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm when she felt that subtle tightening in the air, like the atmosphere itself was bracing for something. A moment later, the overhead speakers crackled. Code Blue, ICU Room 312. Code Blue, ICU Room 312. Her heart kicked once, hard. She pushed her chair back, muscle memory taking over. Stethoscope in hand, she glanced at the unit map, even though she already knew where 312 was, her hallway, her responsibility. But her brain stalled on one simple fact. Room 312 was empty. Had been empty for 3 days. "Did we get a new admit?" she called, already half standing. Jamie, another night nurse charting at the far computer, looked up sharply. "No, we haven't, put anyone in 312 since they deep cleaned it." The overhead repeated, urgent and flat. Code Blue, ICU Room 312. Code Blue, ICU Room 312. Her charge nurse, Maria, was already pushing back from her desk, snapping on gloves as she moved. "Let us go. You're closest." They started down the hallway together, shoes whispering on waxed floors. The corridor lights at night were lowered to a soft, perpetual dusk, making the glow from the door monitors even more noticeable. As she walked, she glanced into the windows of the rooms she passed rise and fall of ventilated chests. Faint shadows of patients turned on their sides, equipment blinking in steady patterns. Then she saw the monitor above 312. It was on, fully active. That shouldn't have been possible. The display outside the door showed a full set of vitals. HR 94 BPM, SpO2 98, RR 18, BP 124 76, cuff cycling. Under that, in small letters, bed occupied. Her steps slowed. The weight of the stethoscope around her neck suddenly felt heavier. "That's wrong," Jamie muttered behind her. Maria didn't tee slow. She pushed open the door to 312, and the motion sensor lights flicked on in a sterile burst. The bed was made, perfectly. Sheets pulled tight, pillow undisturbed, no patient, no family chair pulled out, no IV poles plugged in, no pumps, no ventilator, nothing. Just an unused ICU room, except the monitor by the bed glowed with the same vitals, same heart rate, same oxygen saturation, same gentle green sinus rhythm tracing across the screen as if someone lay there calmly breathing. The bed control panel showed a solid green indicator in the rail. Bed occupied. She walked closer, the air in the room feeling just a few degrees colder than the hallway. Reaching out, she pressed her hand into the mattress. The foam compressed, cool and firm under her palm. The indicator remained solid. "Maybe it's pulling from another room," she said, though the explanation already sounded thin even to her. Cross-wired monitors happened in older wings, but this unit had been upgraded last year. Maria checked the leads port and cables. Every connector was coiled neatly. No wires attached to anything. The pulse aux cable hung untouched. The blood pressure cuff dangled from its hook, Velcro still sealed. "Call the clerk." "Ask what Central S seeing," Maria said without looking up. She pulled her portable phone from her pocket and dialed the number for the unit clerk. "Can you check the central monitor? Are you seeing activity in 312? There was a pause on the other end. Then the clerk's voice came back, a little thinner than usual. "Yeah, Ivy got a full strip. It popped up right before the code blue fired. Looks like a stable NSR. It's been running for about 3 minutes now. I thought we'd missed an admit." "There's no one in the room," the nurse said quietly. Silence. "What?" "The room is empty. No patient, no equipment, nothing hooked up. But Central is reading vitals?" "Still is," the clerk answered. "If it's a glitch, it's a very committed one." Behind her, the code blue alarm overhead cut off mid-cycle. Not faded out, just stopped. The silence that followed felt too abrupt, too deliberate. Maria walked to the code button on the wall. The light beneath it was already off. "Neither of us touched that," she said. The nurse looked at the button, then at the empty bed, then at the monitor that happily displayed a living, breathing human being who did not exist. "Take 312 offline from the board," Maria said finally. "We'll put in a ticket for Biomed in the morning. Mark it as a monitor malfunction." It was the only explanation that fit on paper. They stepped back into the hallway. At the central station, the square for 312 on the central monitor flickered once and went black, as if someone had manually discharged the patient. The rest of the shift passed without incident. No more phantom code blues, no strange vitals. Just the usual dance of drips, assessments, and quiet conversations with sedated patients who would never remember them. Still, every time she walked past 312, she felt her shoulders tighten, waiting for the monitor to suddenly flicker back on. It didn't tee. By 7 a.m., day shift had arrived, bringing too bright energy and coffee breath and chatter. Report took longer than usual because she hesitated over how to describe what had happened. "Code triggered on 312, she said eventually. Monitor showed activity. Biomed ticket placed. I think it's a system glitch, just keep an eye if it comes back." The day nurse, a woman who had no reason to doubt anything, just nodded and moved on to the next room in the report. She went home, showered, and lay down. Sleep came in bursts. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the empty bed with the green, occupied light glowing stubbornly in the corner of her vision. She told herself it was nothing. The hospital was full of small, stupid malfunctions, elevators that stuck, badge readers that refused to cooperate, monitors that registered heartbeats from thin air. But when she returned the next night, her eyes went straight to 3-12 before she'd even clocked in. Dark. The door was closed. The external monitor blank. She exhaled, tension she hadn't admitted to carrying loosening in her chest. "Hey, you got the same side tonight," Jamie called from the station. No one else touched 312. Biomed said they'll check it whenever they get to it. So, sometime around the apocalypse. She smirked, signed into the computer, and pulled up her patient list. Different faces tonight. The septic patient had transferred to step-down. One of her vented patients had coded and been transferred to another facility. A new post-op, a GI bleed, a confused elderly man who kept trying to climb over the bed rails. By 2:45 a.m., she made her rounds, adjusted drips, and charted. The storm from the night before seemed to be thinking about returning. Flashes of distant lightning flickered through the narrow strip of window at the far end of the hall. The unit lights buzzed softly overhead. At 3:11 a.m., she happened to glance at the big red clock. At 3:12 a.m., the external monitor above 312 flickered on. She didn't see it immediately. What she noticed first was the change at Central. The clerk, a young guy who mostly kept to himself, leaned closer to the central monitor with a frown. Did we get someone in 312? He asked. Her chest tightened. She turned. From the station, she had a clear line of sight down the hall. The door to 312 was still closed. No housekeeping cart in front of it, no transport team, just a quiet, unused room. But the display above the door glowed again. HR 90, SPO2 99, RR 17. BP cycling in calm, green numbers. Her mouth went dry. "Maybe someone admitted while we weren't looking," the clerk offered, hope in his voice. She shook her head. "No one comes into my rooms without me." As if on cue, the overhead speakers crackled. "Code Blue, ICU room 312. Code Blue, ICU room 312. Her heart rate spiked to match the rhythm. For an absurd second, she imagined her own telemetry showing up in that empty room. Maria appeared at her elbow almost instantly. "Again?" "Same room," she said. "Same vitals," the clerk called from Central. "It's like someone got assigned again." This time, as she walked toward 312, she felt an odd pressure in her ears, a subtle tightening like the change in a plane S cabin during ascent. The hallway looked the same: doors, monitors, dimmed lights, but something in the air felt heavier, as if the ceiling had lowered a fraction of an inch. The monitor above 312 showed a perfect regular strip of sinus rhythm. No PVCs, no artifact, no wild oscillations, just the steady heartbeat of someone who was fine. "Whoever our ghost patient is, they were very stable," Jamie whispered behind her, trying to make light of the tension twisting around all of them. Maria opened the door. The motion lights blinked on. The bed was still made, still empty. But this time, the call light over the head of the bed was illuminated. On. The panel at the nurse's station verified it a second later, a soft ping and a flash on the screen. 312 call light. "That S impossible," the clerk said over the intercom. "There S no one to hit the button." The nurse stepped inside. The room felt colder again, but not in a full-body way. It was more localized. Her arms prickled with goosebumps as she moved closer to the bed. The handheld call button lay on the sheet near the center of the mattress, coiled cord curling toward the wall port. It wasn't he under anything. It wasn't he stuck. The plastic casing was clean, nothing obstructing it. The indicator on it glowed red. "Maybe the button is jammed," Maria said. The nurse reached out and pressed it to reset. The red light clicked off. A second later, the call screen at the station cleared. She turned to look at the monitor. The vitals continued as if nothing had happened. Heart rate in the 90s. Oxygen saturation pristine. Waveforms smooth and undisturbed. A code blue was still blaring on overhead. No one had reset it. The sound cut out mid-cycle again. No one had touched that either. "Okay," Maria said quietly. "Now it's weird." A faint wetness brushed the nurse's forearm. She looked down. The sleeve of her scrub top was dry. Her skin was dry. But for just a second, it had felt like something damp and cold had passed against her. "You feel that?" she asked. "Feel what?" "Nothing," she lied. When they stepped out into the hallway, the monitor over the door flickered off. Central went dark again for 312. The clerk swiveled in his chair. "Everyone saw that, right? So, when I start questioning my sanity at 5 a.m., you all confirm this happened?" "Documented in the log," Maria said. "Everything. Time, vitals, code blue, call light, all of it. And I am paging Biomed now. They can drag themselves out of bed like the rest of us." The nurse went back to her assigned patients, but the night had shifted. The background hum of the unit no longer felt neutral. Every monitor chirp made her flinch a little harder. Every call light seemed louder. During her 4:02 a.m. rounds, she had to pass 312. She did what every nurse did in situations like this, pretended not to be spooked, while absolutely being spooked. As she walked by, the small glass window set into the door reflected her silhouette. For half a second, she thought she saw someone standing behind her in that reflection, tall, indistinct, just over her shoulder. She spun around. The room was dark. The door was closed. The monitor was off. Her own reflection, faint and tired, stared back. By morning, there was an official explanation in the making. Biomed came up, ran tests, shrugged, and muttered about relay issues and phantom signals. They promised a deeper investigation. The hospitalist on call listened to the story with a half-amused skepticism, shook his head, and called it great ghost story material for the break room. She didn't to tell them about the damp cold she'd felt on her arm, or the way the code blue kept canceling itself, or that strange moment in the window. Those details felt too fragile to hand over to people ready to laugh them away. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, she wasn't on shift. She found out at change of shift report when the day nurse, looking pale and jittery, said, "Oh, and 312 fired off another code blue last night." Charge almost called a full team before they realized it was the dead room again. Ask Jamie about it. She was here. Jamie's version was similar. External monitor on at 3:12 a.m. Perfect vitals. Call light. Code blue overhead. Empty room. Nothing hooked to anything. The same sequence, almost down to the minute. "That S 3 times now," Jamie said. 3 nights. Same hour. "If it does it again, I am bringing holy water." They tried to laugh it off. They shared it with the respiratory therapist, who added it to his list of ICU weirdness stories. She listened, smiled where expected, and filed away the details in her own mind with a different kind of seriousness. 3 nights. Same room, same time, same pattern. Patterns meant something. In medicine, in alarms, in human behavior. They rarely happened by accident. The next night, she was back on. She started the shift already aware of the clock. At midnight, she tried not to check it too often. At 2:30, she pretended she wasn't counting down. By 3:05, she had drifted to the nurse's station, the charting she needed to do suddenly done earlier than usual. She told herself she just wanted to be near Central in case anything happened. At 3:11 a.m., she stood behind the clerk's chair, pretending to scroll through a chart. The red clock ticked to 3:12. The square for 312 on the central monitor flashed to life. Vitals populated in a cascade of numbers and waveforms, as if someone had just wheeled a new admit into the room and clipped on the leads. Her chest tightened. A fraction of a second later, the overhead began. Code blue, ICU room 3D12. Code blue, ICU room 312. No one moved at first, not out of negligence, but out of that stunned hesitation that happens when something impossible starts to repeat. Maria was already walking toward the hall, though, jaw set. "You coming?" she asked. The nurse nodded and followed. As they approached 312, the lights seemed dimmer than before, even for night mode. The door monitor showed an even more complete picture now. In addition to vitals, a little stick figure icon indicated bed exit alarm on. The bed occupancy indicator flashed between occupied and movement. The call light was on again. The nurse opened the door before Maria could, as if getting inside faster would somehow prove that, this time, it was just a stupid glitch. The room lights came on in a slow fade, like someone had turned a dimmer rather than a sensor reacting. That was new. Motion lights usually clicked on fast. The bed was still empty, but the sheets were different. It took her a second to understand why. The top sheet had a single, shallow impression in the center. A faint bowl in the fabric, like someone had just gotten up. The call button lay on the sheet, near where a hand would land if someone reached blindly in the dark. The bed rail indicator flashed. Bed exit alarm. Her scalp prickled. "Do you see that?" she asked. Maria stared. "Please tell me someone sat on that bed before we closed this room." "No one has been in here." The external alarm for a bed exit chimed once in the hallway, then cut off abruptly, as if someone had silenced it at the bedside, but neither of them had touched that panel yet. The nurse stepped closer. The air felt denser, as if she were pushing against something invisible. Her fingers brushed the top sheet. It was cold. Not just no patient cool cold in a way that reminded her of stepping into a refrigerated medication room. She glanced at the monitor. The heart rhythm had changed. Still sinus, still technically fine, but with a slight irregularity at the edges now, an occasional premature beat. "PVCs," she said under her breath. "If this were a real patient, I'd be paging the doc." "You are not paging anyone for the ghost in 312, Maria said, but the joke sounded weak. A soft sound broke the tension, just a tiny click. The call light on the wall went off. The handheld button on the bed was no longer lit. No one was touching it. "Okay." "Enough," Maria said. "We're reclosing this room officially. I am having it taken off the board entirely until Biomed and IT both sign off." They backed out of the room. As soon as the door swung almost shut, the monitor above it went black. At Central, 312S box collapsed in on itself and disappeared like a window being closed. The code blue announcement ended mid-phrase again. The clerk swore quietly under his breath and started typing in the log. The nurse went back to her other patients, but her mind stayed in front of that empty bed, watching the sheets, listening for a call light that had no one to press it. During a rare, quiet moment, she opened the hospital's electronic record system and searched for room 312. She wasn't really supposed to dig through old charts without a reason, but curiosity had its own pull. The system showed a history of patients who had been assigned there over the last year. Post-op, ARDS, COVID, stroke, standard ICU mix. She clicked back further, paging through old admissions. 6 months ago, 312 had been marked out of service for environmental remediation. Before that, it had housed a long-term patient for weeks, an older man with a complex cardiac history. He decoded 3 times before eventually passing away there. He wasn't the only one. 312's history looked busy, but nothing about that was unique. Every ICU room had patterns if you looked long enough. Some rooms seemed to attract certain types of patients. Some never stayed empty for long. Others remained closed more often than not. Nurses joked about cursed rooms, but it was just that, jokes. People died in hospitals. That was what hospitals were for. Still, an uncomfortable thought crept in. The codes they'd heard for 312 weren't attached to any chart. No MRN, no admission. Someone, or something, was occupying the bed in the system without existing anywhere else. On her next break, she found the clerk scrolling through the code blue log. "Anything weird?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "You could say that. The system shows the code blue for 312 was acknowledged and cancelled from the bedside panel. It logs who pressed what. And—" he turned the screen so she could see. In the field where the badge ID should have been, there was a blank space. Then a single timestamp. No user, no credential. "No badge?" she said. "Not even a generic unassigned, like when someone forgets to log in. It is like the system thinks someone who doesn't exist cancelled the code." She stared at the screen until the numbers started to blur. That night, she woke up 3 hours after, leaving work, heart pounding, certain she'd heard a monitor alarm in her bedroom. It took several confused seconds to understand that the sound was the low, steady hum of her window AC unit and a car alarm going off distantly outside. She turned onto her back, staring at the ceiling, and thought about 312, about codes that cancelled themselves, about empty beds that registered wait, about call lights pressed by no one. She told herself it was just a story, just another bizarre unit legend, something to add to the running list. The patient who swore someone sat on their bed all night. The automatic doors that opened for no one. The elevator that always stopped on the same floor. Only this time, she had seen the charting, the numbers, the logs. This wasn't a patient's story. It was the hospital's own machines behaving like they'd have been given instructions from something unseen. The next shift, she found a sticky note taped to the unit computer with a scribbled message from the day charge. 312, do not assign it. Biomed ticket open, keep log of all events. Maria met her gaze and shrugged. If Administration S worried enough to write it down, you know it, AS bad. Admin believes this? They believe in liability, Maria said. If a code fires and someone doesn't respond because, oh, that is the haunted room, and then it turns out to be real, that is a nightmare. So now, if anything happens in 312, we document it, all of it. It was meant to be reassuring logic, structure, procedure. Instead, it felt like the hospital had quietly admitted something was happening there. The nurse added her own notes that night. 0312, code blue for 312. Monitor active, full vitals. Bed occupancy indicated, call light triggered. Room empty upon physical check, no equipment attached. Code cancelled from bedside with no badge ID. She kept her handwriting steady as she wrote, but her fingers still trembled slightly when she set the pen down. Later in the shift, she walked past 312 again. The door was closed. The little window was dark. Halfway down the hall, she heard it. 3 soft, sequential chimes, the sound of a call light activating. Not the harsh code blue tone, but the gentler, familiar noise of a patient pressing the button for help. Her body reacted before her mind processed it. She turned. The call light indicator above 312 glowed amber. At the nurse's station, the call board lit up for 312, as if a very real patient had just asked for something. She was closest. It was her hallway. She walked back, each step echoing a little too loudly in her own ears. At the door, she paused. Her badge buzzed slightly, as it sometimes did near certain equipment static, maybe, or interference. She opened the door. The bed was made. The sheets were smooth. The call light on the wall was on. The handheld button lay on the bed. No one. 312. "How can I help you?" she said softly, out of habit more than anything. The words came out in the exact tone she used for every patient ever. Calm, warm, professional. The call light clicked off. She stood very still. The hair at the back of her neck rose. For a moment, she had the distinct unnerving sense of not being alone. Not in a vague way, but in the exact way she felt when a patient as family member stood quietly in a corner, the sense of another presence occupying space. She couldn't see anyone. She couldn't hear anything but the low hum of the vent and distant monitor beeps from other rooms. But she knew, with the same certainty she knew her own name, that something in that room had heard her. She backed away slowly, never quite taking her eyes off the bed, and closed the door with more care than necessary. When she got back to the nurse's station, Jamie raised an eyebrow. Answering the ghosts now? She used the words she answered a dozen times a night. If someone asks going to keep hitting the call light, I am going to keep answering it. Jamie snorted, but there was no cruelty in it, just the brittle humor of people who had seen too much. You were braver than me. She didn't feel brave. She felt responsible. If the Hospital S systems were convinced someone was in 312, then someone or something kept asking for help. Call that superstition, glitch, or haunting it. Didn't it change the reflex wired into her after years in critical care? Patients called. Nurses answered. She didn't know yet who or what was calling from bed 312. She didn't know why the codes came at 3:12 a.m., or why the bed thought someone lay there when it was empty to every human eye. All she knew was that, in that quiet, humming Texas ICU, there was now one more patient on her mental list. And unlike the others, this one had no admission band, no chart, no diagnosis, only a bed, a set of impossible vitals, and a call light that kept coming back on. Story 2. The Man in the Visitor Chair. The man in the visitor chair never showed up during the day shift. He only came at night. That was the first detail that stuck with her. On days, the ICU felt almost crowded. Residents rounding in groups, consultants spinning in and out of rooms, respiratory therapists adjusting ventilators, case managers, social workers, family members with questions and worried eyes. The chairs in corners were always full then, with relatives holding coffee cups, staring at monitors, whispering prayers into folded hands. But at night, Those same chairs sat empty more often than not. Just shadows under dimmed lights, a folded blanket, a discarded magazine, a plastic bag of someone else's belongings that nobody wanted to look at too closely. That was why he stood out so much the first time she saw him, because no one was supposed to be sitting there. Her name was Erin, and she had been an ICU nurse in the Texas system for nearly 6 years. She worked nights by choice. The pay was a little better, but that wasn't why she stayed on. Nights felt cleaner, less chaos, fewer people asking for 1,000 things at once. Just the patients, the machines, and the handful of staff who were awake with them while the rest of the city slept. She floated between 3 different ICUs inside the same hospital: medical, surgical, and cardiac, depending on staffing needs. It made her more flexible, which administration loved. It also meant she had seen just about everything a critical care nurse could see: septic shock that came out of nowhere, post-op bleeds, failed transplants, ventilators that wouldn't cooperate, codes that started and ended too fast. The first time she noticed the man in the visitor chair, she was too tired to think much of it. It was a quiet night in the medical ICU. She'd had just finished titrating a drip and slipping out of a room when she saw him through the glass of bed 8. An older man, sitting perfectly still in the corner visitor chair. He was dressed like someone who had come straight from home. Dark slacks, a pale button-down shirt, an old cardigan, the kind that looked soft and worn at the elbows. His hair was gray and neatly combed. His hands were folded loosely in his lap. He didn't look like most of the visitors she saw. No frantic energy, no puffy red eyes, no half-finished texts on his phone. Just a kind of quiet, patient presence. It was 2:47 a.m. Visiting hours in the ICU had ended at 9 p.m. Only special exceptions stayed this late, and when they did, Erin usually knew about it. She took a step closer to the glass, frowning. The patient in bed 8 was a woman in her 50s, recovering from a nasty pneumonia. She was on high-flow oxygen but improving. Her family had left around 10 p.m., after the woman had finally fallen asleep. Erin remembered that clearly because she'd promised the woman's husband she would call if anything changed. She was almost sure this wasn't him. He looked older, thinner, different build entirely. Erin glanced at the assignment sheet on her clipboard. Bed 8 belonged to another nurse tonight. Not her, but that didn't matter. They all watched out for each other's patients. She stepped into the room. The door hissed softly as it sealed shut behind her. The woman in the bed was asleep, breathing steadily, her chest rising and falling under the thin blanket. The monitors above her showed a stable heart rhythm in the 80s and an oxygen saturation of 94 on high flow. Nothing alarming, nothing concerning. The corner chair sat empty. There was no cardigan, no neatly folded hands, no older man. For a second, Erin simply stared at the chair, the way you do when you walk into a room and forget why you went there. A quiet static filled her head. She'd just seen someone there. Not a shadow in her peripheral vision. Not a quick flash. A full, clear shape. She turned slowly and looked back through the glass panel into the hallway. Everything out there looked normal. The unit clerk at the central desk was typing. The respiratory therapist was pushing a cart past bed 10. The clock above the nurse's station read 2:48 a.m. She checked the bathroom attached to the room, just in case the visitor had moved quickly and quietly. Empty. "It's just late," she muttered to herself. "You're just tired." When she stepped back out into the hallway, She scanned the unit again. People, doors, monitors. Nothing out of place. The moment already felt thin, like something that would dissolve under the fluorescent lights of morning. She didn't mention it to anyone. Night shift nurses saw strange things sometimes. Sleep deprivation, adrenaline, and dim lighting played tricks on the brain. You learned to let most of it slide, or you'd start jumping at reflections in monitor screens. She forgot about it, until a week later. This time, she was floating to the surgical ICU. Different hallway, different unit clerk, different attendings, same hospital, same fourth floor. She had 2 fresh post-ops, and 1 long-term patient who had been there so long he knew the staff rotation by heart. It was just after 3:15 a.m. when the man appeared again. She had stepped out of a room to check a lab result, rubbing at the knot forming at the back of her neck, when a shape caught her eye at the far end of the hall. In bed 3's room, through the glass, she saw someone sitting in the visitor chair. At first, she didn't recognize him. It was the same cardigan, the same gray hair, the same still posture. But things gained meaning when they repeated. Her mind put the pieces together faster this time. Older man, corner chair, night shift. He was turned slightly toward the bed, as if keeping an eye on the patient. Erin felt a small, irrational stab of irritation. If he'd snuck in past visiting hours, she'd have to be the one to gently escort him out, explain hospital policy, probably soothe someone who just wanted to stay with their loved one. She hated being the bad guy. It always felt cruel, even when it was necessary. She walked down the hall. The click of her shoes on the floor sounded too loud to her own ears. As she approached, she got a clearer look. He wasn't looking at the patient. He was looking straight ahead, at nothing really, his gaze somewhere in the middle distance. His face was calm, almost blank. Not content, not sad, more like neutral. Waiting. She realized with a faint unease that he didn't blink. She pushed that thought aside. That was ridiculous. She was too far away to notice something like that. She opened the door. The air inside felt cooler than the hallway. The monitors beeped in their steady rhythm. Bed 3's patient, a man in his 40s who had abdominal surgery earlier that day, was dozing lightly, his vital signs stable. The visitor chair in the corner was empty. Erin's stomach did a strange little flip. She checked the bathroom, the corner behind the curtain, even glanced under the bed, as if an older man in a cardigan might have decided to lie on the floor for some reason. Nothing. She stepped back to the hall and shut the door carefully. Her co-worker, Nadia, walked by with a linen cart and gave her a look. "You okay?" "Yeah," Erin forced a casual tone. "Thought I saw a visitor still in there. Guess I was wrong." Nadia smirked. "You sure you didn't just see your soul leaving your body? Because mine's been trying to clock out since midnight." Erin laughed, because that was the expected response, and let the moment slide past them. But that night, the image stayed with her longer. The cardigan, the hands folded, the stillness, 2 separate ICUs, 2 different patients. Same man. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a volunteer or a staff member she didn't know well yet, someone who liked to sit with patients at night. Maybe she'd just caught him twice, and he moved quickly. The human brain loved patterns. It could turn coincidence into conspiracy in a heartbeat. She almost convinced herself, until the first crash. It happened in the cardiac ICU 3 weeks later. She was back on her home turf now, the unit she'd spent the most years in. Cardiac was more intense in some ways. The monitors were higher stakes. The rhythms on those screens decided everything: how fast you moved, how loud you called for help, whether you walked or ran. It was one of those nights that felt deceptively calm. Her patients were as stable as cardiac patients got: a post-KBG with predictable pain, a heart failure patient on milrinone, a middle-aged woman post-awake ablation, scared but doing well. The hallway lights were low. The unit clerk was half watching a muted crime show on his phone between charting entries. Aaron was in the middle of changing a dressing when the intercom crackled to life. "Hey, Aaron?" The clerk's voice came through, low and hesitant. "Do you have family in 5? She paused, tape in one hand. "No. They all left around midnight." "Why?" There was a beat of silence. "Just wondering. I see someone sitting in the chair in there." A chill crawled across her scalp. "Can you check the board?" she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Any late visitor bands still logged in for 5? She heard the faint clicking of his keyboard. "Nope. No visitors on the unit at all right now." Her patient watched her with curious eyes as she smoothed the dressing down and forced a smile. "I'll be right back. Just need to check on something." She stepped out into the hall and looked down toward bed 5. The glass window framed a familiar scene. Corner chair, older man, same cardigan, same still hands, same neutral expression. But something about him felt sharper this time, more in focus, like a camera lens had finally been turned correctly. She could see faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the way his hair thinned at the crown, the soft slouch of his shoulders. Her skin tingled. She walked down the hall. Halfway there, the telemetry monitor above bed 5 flickered. The heart rhythm strip, which had been a steady-paced rhythm the last time she'd glanced at it, jumped abruptly. 1 beat. 2. Then a run of something fast and chaotic. She picked up her pace, all her focus snapping to the waveforms. Inside the room, the man in the chair didn't move. He just sat, facing the bed. The door swung open as she pushed it. The sound hit her first. The monitor beside the bed erupted into a high-pitched alarm. The patient in bed 5, a man in his 70s with a new pacemaker, lay rigid, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and unfocused, his hands clawed weakly at the sheets. The chair was empty. The rhythm on the screen was ventricular tachycardia, the kind that made your stomach drop. "VTAC!" she shouted, hand already slamming the code button. "We in VTAC in 5. Everything became motion and protocol then. People ran in from everywhere. The respiratory therapist, the charge nurse, another RN grabbing the crash cart, the on-call resident stumbling in with his hair flattened on one side, pads on, oxygen up, CPR ready. Aaron's world narrowed to compressions, drugs, doses, joules. Her muscles burned. Sweat dampened her neck. Time stretched and contracted in strange ways, as it always did during codes. They got him back, finally. The VTAC broke into something they could work with. A weak but organized rhythm crept across the screen. The man's chest rose shakily with assisted breaths. The room stank of adrenaline and antiseptic, and the faint electrical tang of defibrillation. When the dust settled and the attending stepped out to call the family, Aaron leaned against the wall for a moment, feeling the tremor in her own hands. She glanced toward the corner. The visitor chair sat in its usual spot. Empty. She told herself that was normal. The next day, during shift handoff, another nurse mentioned it casually while flipping through sheets. Bed 5 had someone sitting with him right before he crashed. "Didn't he?" the day nurse asked. Family? Erin hesitated. Why do you say that? Security. Came up looking for a guy, the day nurse said. Older man, gray hair, cardigan. One of the techs thought he saw someone slip out without a visitor band. They wanted to know if he belonged to one of the patients. Nobody claimed him. Erin's heart gave a slow, heavy thud. Older man, she repeated. Gray hair, cardigan. Yeah. One of the respiratory guys joked that he looked like somebody's grandpa who'd taken a wrong turn on the way to the cafeteria. The day nurse shrugged. Security checked the cameras, I think, but I never heard anything else. Erin went home that morning with a weight sitting under her ribs. Once might be nothing. Twice might be nerves. 3 times, with a crash attached, felt like a pattern. She tried to push it away. She had laundry to do, bills to pay, a sink full of dishes. Ordinary life demanded attention. But that night, when she lay down in the dark, the image of the man sitting in the visitor chair drifted behind her closed eyes like an afterimage. He never looked surprised to be there. He never looked distressed. He just sat and waited. Always in the corner, always still, always right before something went wrong. The stories began filtering in slowly. Not as ghost stories at first, more like offhand comments, little overlaps that made her stomach tighten each time. A few days after the code in 5, she was grabbing coffee at the small break room table, hands wrapped around the styrofoam cup for warmth she didn't need, when she overheard 2 nurses from the medical ICU talking. I swear someone was in 12 last night, one of them said. I walk by, and there's this old man sitting in the chair. Next minute I go in and my patient bottoms out. Blood pressure in the toilet. Whole thing turns into a mess. By the time we get her stabilized, the chair's empty again. The other nurse snorted. You sure it wasn't just your brain trying to warn you? No, this was. The first nurse shook her head. He looked so solid, like you or me. I was about to go in and ask who he was. Then everything went sideways. Maybe it was a family member. Then why didn't he move? He didn't even look at me. Erin didn't jump into the conversation. She just sat quietly, listening, her coffee cooling in her hands. A week later, in the surgical ICU, she heard someone else. Have you guys seen the grandpa? A tech asked casually, scrolling through her phone between turns. What grandpa? You know, the one that sits in the chair right before a crap storm. A couple of people laughed. One of the older nurses made the face. Oh, Dante, start that again. Start what? A traveler asked, curious. The man in the chair story, the older nurse said. Every couple of years someone sees a shadow in a corner, and suddenly he's the angel of death. She rolled her eyes. We in an ICU. People crash. That's not a haunting. That's the job. The tech shrugged. I am just saying. I've seen him twice now. Always in the corner, always quiet. Next thing I know, there's a code. You probably just noticed him because something bad happened, the older nurse insisted. If nothing had gone wrong, you wouldn't even remember what he looked like. The traveler leaned in. What does he look like? Old, the tech said. White hair, cardigan, gives grandpa vibes, but not in a cozy way. More like in a, how did you get up here without a badge way? Erin looked down at her hands, feeling the skin on her arms pebble with goosebumps. They were describing the same man. Different units, different nights, different patients. Same cardigan, same hair, same chair. The stories kept stacking. Nobody was trying to convince anyone of anything. It was just small, repeated details that lined up too neatly. He never spoke. He never touched anyone. He only sat in the same spot in the visitor chair, tucked slightly out of the way, in the shadows of the room watching. Or maybe not even watching, really. Just existing there, on the edge of everything, and always, always right before a patient crashed. It took Erin a month before she said anything to anyone. She chose carefully. It was a slower night in cardiac again, the kind where people finished their charting early and pretended not to look at the clock every 5 minutes. Her friend Louise, a night shift respiratory therapist who'd been working the floors almost as long as she had, was sitting at the station with a bag of chips and a pile of RT notes. They'd known each other long enough to trade tired jokes and gallows humor, the kind that only made sense to people awake at 3:15 a.m. in a place where death was never entirely hypothetical. "You ever seen him?" she asked quietly, sliding into the chair next to him. "Seen who?" Louise asked, without looking up. "The man in the visitor chair." He froze, very slightly, but she noticed. He set his pen down and turned his head to look at her. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You know what I mean," she said. "Older guy. Gray hair, sweater or cardigan. Shows up in the corner chair right before something goes really wrong." Luis didn't answer for a moment. His eyes flicked down the hall, as if expecting to see someone sitting quietly at the end of it. "You've seen him?" he said finally. "3 times, she admitted. "Maybe more, and I only remember those 3, because of what happened after." "What happened?" "VTAC in cardiac, pressure crash in med, respiratory failure in neuro the night I floated over there. Every time I saw him, something went bad within 10-15 minutes. Always in that room. Always that patient." Luis leaned back in his chair slowly, folding his arms. "I thought it was just me," he said. "I didn't want to say anything, because I figured everybody would tell me to sleep more and drink less coffee." "Tell me," she said. He exhaled, a long, tired sound. "First time was a couple of years ago," he said. "Back when I was still mostly on nights in this hospital. I walked past a room in med ICU and saw some older guy sitting with a patient. Didn't think much of it. Thought maybe they'd gotten an exception to stay. But the thing was, we'd literally just had that conversation at the station like 10 minutes before, about how the patient had no family within driving distance." He paused, picking at the edge of the chip bag. "I went back to the room to double-check something about the vent settings," he continued. Chair was empty. Patient tanked half an hour later. ARDS. Went from rough but stable to, "Oh, this is bad," in under 15 minutes. "Second time?" she prompted quietly. "Cardiac unit," he said. "Old guy, maybe 70s, post-MI, doing okay. Stable on BiPAP. I walk by the room on my way to check vents, and there's that same dude in the chair. Sweater, gray hair, hands folded just like he gestured vaguely, as if the posture were too familiar to fully describe. I blink, look away for a second because someone called my name. Look back, chair S empty. 5 minutes later, the guy S in full arrest. He rubbed a hand over his face. I told myself it was just a coincidence, he said. We work where people are on the edge. They're going to fall off sometimes. But after I saw him the 4th time, I stopped telling anyone about it. 4th? Luis nodded. Surgical ICU. Young trauma patient. Should have made it. I walked by his room and there he was. Same man, same chair. I didn't go in. I couldn't tea. I kept walking like I hadn't seen anything. Kid coded within the hour. Erin swallowed. Her mouth felt dry. So it's not just this hospital, she said quietly. People are talking about him downstairs, too. I floated to the other campus last month. Someone mentioned a visitor like that there, too. Louise stared at the wall for a long moment. What do you think he is? He asked. She thought of all the families she'd watched sit in those same chairs, waiting for news. The way some of them looked at their loved ones with fierce hope, others with quiet resignation. The way the chair always seemed to absorb the tension, the worry, the grief. I don't know, she said. I just know I don't like that he never talks. For a while after that, she didn't see him. It was almost worse, because every time she walked past a room with a vulnerable patient inside, her eyes flicked automatically to the corner chair. Every empty chair felt like borrowed time. When he finally did appear again, it wasn't in the ICU at all. She had floated down to a step-down telemetry unit that was short-staffed. Different layout, different lighting, different vibe. Less machinery, more call lights. Patients here were supposed to be more stable, the ones who degraduated from intensive care but weren't quite ready for a regular floor. She was hanging a bag of IV antibiotics outside a door when something tugged at her attention. It was subtle, like the feeling of being watched in a crowded room. She looked through the narrow window into room 214. Visitor chair. Older man. Same cardigan. Same still posture. The patient. In that room, according to her notes, was a middle-aged woman recovering from a complicated pneumonia. She'd been in ICU last week, on a ventilator. Now she was here, on nasal cannula oxygen, walking short distances with help. Stable, the note had said. Erin's heart started thudding hard in her chest. She didn't go into the room right away. Instead, she went to the nearest monitor station and checked the woman's vitals. Heart rate in the 90s, oxygen saturation 93. Blood pressure a bit soft but acceptable. Nothing screaming catastrophe. She looked back at the door. The man in the chair had not moved. She walked to the doorway. Her palms felt sweaty against the metal of the handle. She opened the door. The woman in the bed smiled faintly at her. "Oh, hey," she said, voice still scratchy from the recent intubation. "Is it time for my meds?" "We were a little early," Erin said automatically. "Just checking on you." Her eyes cut to the chair. Empty. The woman followed her gaze. "Is someone supposed to be here?" "No," Erin said quickly, "just making sure everything's okay." Her chest felt tight. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. "Just tired." The woman shifted on the bed. "Breathing's okay. They said I might get to go home next week." Erin nodded, then did something she wasn't even fully conscious of deciding to do. She checked the woman's oxygen more carefully, looked at her skin, listened to her lungs, watched the muscles in her neck for any subtle pulling that might suggest the beginning of distress. There was nothing obvious. Still, unease slithered along the back of her mind. She increased the frequency of her checks on that room. Every slightly weird reading, every small complaint, drew her attention. She called the provider once about a borderline blood pressure. Asked for a chest X-ray when the woman mentioned feeling a little heavier in her chest. Tweaked the oxygen flow a notch higher than she might have otherwise. None of it was dramatic. Nothing screamed emergency. 3 hours later, during shift handoff, the day nurse reported that the woman had had a brief episode of atrial fibrillation around dawn. Heart rate spiked, alarms went off, meds were given, and she deconverted back to normal rhythm. Could be been worse if we weren't already watching her so closely, the day nurse said. Good catch on the X-ray, by the way. It showed a little fluid creeping back. We got ahead of it. Erin nodded mechanically. Her mind was somewhere else. The man had been in the chair. The patient had destabilized. But not fatally. Not this time. She went home that morning feeling unsteady, like the ground under her feet was softer than she'd thought. He wasn't just attached to ICU rooms. He followed patients. Or he followed events. He was some kind of harbinger. A warning sign that only a few of them could see. Weeks went by. She saw him again and again. Sometimes she caught him only in reflections in the glass of monitor screens, the shine of a dark window at the end of a hall, the polished metal of a crash cart. Other times, he was there directly, in the corner of her vision as she walked by a doorway. If she turned her head too quickly, the chair would be empty again. If she didn't look at all, she could feel the weight of someone occupying that space anyway. Sometimes the patients crashed. Sometimes they didn't. That almost made it worse, because it meant he didn't always mean death. Just danger. Change. A thin line being walked that might tip either way. She started dreaming about him. In her dreams, he was always sitting in the same chair, but the room around him changed. ICU, step down, ED bay. Even her own small living room once, his cardigan soft and familiar against the unfamiliarity of her space. In the dreams, he never spoke. He just watched, controlled, patient, waiting. She woke from those dreams with a horrible tightness in her chest, like she'd been holding her breath too long. She started reading, quietly at first. Articles about shared hallucinations, stress responses, crisis apparitions. Her search history was a mix of clinical terms and folklore she would have mocked a year ago. She didn't find anything that made her feel better. And then, one night, he looked directly at her. It was a late autumn shift. The air outside had turned crisp in that unpredictable Texas way, chilly at night, still warm during the day. The hospital's heating system hadn't quite caught up, so some corners of the building were freezing while others were uncomfortably warm. Erin was back in the medical ICU. She had a full assignment, including a young man in his 20s with a devastating infection, and an elderly woman whose kidneys had all but given up. The unit hummed with its usual low-level buzz. Nothing unusual, nothing special. It was just after 3 a.m. when it happened. She was walking down the hall to answer a call light for bed 11 when she felt that familiar subtle shift in the air. The noise of the unit seemed to recede slightly, like someone had turned the volume down. The lights felt too bright and too dim at the same time. Her own footsteps sounded distant in her ears. She looked to her left. In bed 9's room, through the glass, she saw the visitor chair occupied. He was there. Same cardigan, same posture. But something was different. He wasn't looking at the patient this time. He was looking straight at her. Their eyes met through the glass. Only then did she realize she had never actually seen his eyes clearly before. She had noticed their general shape, the way his face framed them, but not the eyes themselves. They were a pale, washed-out gray. Not blue, not brown. The color of old X-ray film. The gaze was not cold exactly, but it was utterly without surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Erin stopped walking without meaning to, pinned in place by that look. Her heart started pounding, a thick, heavy knocking against her breastbone. The world, Around her narrowed. Machines, lights. The nurse at the far end of the hall, they all blurred slightly, hazy at the edges. The only thing in razor focus was the man in the chair and the way he was looking at her. He tilted his head just a fraction, like a curious bird. His mouth twitched, and then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a wide grin. It wasn't too sinister in any obvious movie-style way. It was small, controlled, the kind of polite smile you might give a stranger who held a door open for you. But there was something immeasurably wrong about seeing that expression on his face, because in all the months she'd glimpsed him, he had never reacted, never acknowledged anything. He was like a piece of furniture, a fixed point in space. Now he was responding. To her. Her knees felt weak. For one alarming moment, she thought she might actually faint, like one of the fragile visitors who sometimes crumpled when they heard bad news. A monitor alarm shrieked from somewhere behind her. The sound snapped the world back into motion. She tore her gaze away and looked up at the central screen out of sheer instinct. Bed 9's box was flashing red. Blood pressure dropping. Heart rate jumping. Oxygen saturation declining in a steep curve. She ran. The door to 9 swung open hard under her hand. The patient, a man in his 60s with a complicated history of liver disease, lay in bed with his eyes wide and glassy. His skin a terrible gray-green. His chest heaved as he struggled for air. The monitor beside him screamed warnings in relentless tones. The visitor chair was empty. Adrenaline flooded her system. She hit the code button, shouted for help, reached automatically for the oxygen mask, checked his airway, his IV lines, the drainage tubes. People rushed in behind her. Orders flew. Meds were pushed. Fluids were hung. The room filled with bodies and movement. Through it all, a corner of her mind kept replaying the moment his eyes had met hers. The slight tilt of his head. The slow, polite smile. They stabilized the man. Barely. It took everything the team had, but his blood pressure crept back to a barely acceptable level. His breathing eased somewhat under increased oxygen and careful support. When the attending finally said, "Okay, let us see if he holds this," the room exhaled in a collective sigh. Erin stepped out into the hall, her scrubs damp with sweat, her hair sticking to the back of her neck. She looked down the corridor, out of sheer reflex. The glass windows glowed softly under the dimmed lights. She saw her co-workers, the flicker of monitors, the reflection of her own pale face. The visitor chairs sat empty in every room. She forced herself to move, to answer another alarm, to fix another IV pump, to nod along to a resident's hurried explanation for why a lab was delayed. But the feeling lingered, the awareness that something had shifted. He'd seen her. He knew she could see him. He'd smiled. That morning, she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of untouched tea and stared at the grain of the wood, replaying the memory over and over. At some point, she realized her hands were shaking. She opened her laptop and started typing. Not into a search engine this time, but into a blank document. She wrote down every instance she could remember seeing him. Unit, room number, time of night, patient condition. What happened after? The list was longer than she'd expected. Floating between ICUs had given her more opportunities to spot him than someone who stayed in one place. There were at least 15 entries over the past few months alone. Some ended in codes, some ended in rapid response calls, some ended in "nothing happened, but my gut hated it," and one ended in "I saw him, and because I saw him, I watched closer, and something bad was caught early. After an hour, she sat back and stared at the screen. A soft knock at her apartment door made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. She peered through the peephole cautiously. It was Luis. He held up 2 coffees, like peace offerings. "You were too quiet in report this morning," he said when she opened the door. "That's never a good sign. Can I come in?" She nodded and stepped aside. They sat at her small table, the hospital world feeling weirdly distant in the quiet of her apartment. No beeping, no overhead announcements, just the hum of the fridge and the faint traffic noise from outside. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Bad," she said. "But that is not that. It's not why I am like this." Luis watched her carefully. "Okay," he said. "Then what is it?" She turned the laptop toward him. He leaned in, scanning the list. "You've been tracking him," he said quietly. "I had to," she said. Her voice sounded thin, even to her own ears. "I needed to know if I was imagining patterns that weren't there." "And I am not," she said. "He shows up. Patients destabilize. Sometimes we save them. Sometimes we don tea. But he is always there first." Luis nodded slowly. He tapped one of the entries. "Cardiac, bed 5, he said. "That was the pacemaker guy, right?" She nodded. "I remember that night," he said. "I saw him too, you know. In the corner. I thought he was family until he vanished." She swallowed. "Last night, he looked at me. Really looked. And then he smiled." Luis exhaled. "That's new," he said. "It felt like he was acknowledging me," she said. "Like we've been watching each other from opposite sides of the glass all this time. And he finally decided to say hello." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Except he didn't say anything. He just watched me while someone almost died." Luis was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you think he causes it?" She had asked herself the same question 100 times in the last few months. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe he's just there, like smoke after a fire, or like a shadow that falls across something before it breaks. Like an early warning system," Luis said. "If it has a warning, it has a terrible one," she said. "It doesn't tell us who or why or how bad. It just sits there." He stared at the laptop again, at the neat list of units and room numbers and outcomes. "What if," he said slowly, "we treated it like one anyway?" She looked at him. "You mean—" "I mean the next time you see him, you call me," he said. "I don't care what unit it is. I don't care whose patient it is. We pretend we just got a rapid response call and we treat that room like it's about to go to hell." Her pulse kicked up. "That's going to be hard to explain," she said. "You're right," he said. "So we don't explain it. We just start poking around like we had a weird feeling. Nurses get weird feelings all the time. Nobody questions it if it ends up saving someone." A small, fragile spark of something that might have been hope flickered in her chest. If she was going to see this thing, if she was going to carry the weight of those silent visits, maybe she could do something with it. Maybe she didn't have to just stand there and wait for the crash. "Okay," she said. "Next time I see him, I call you." He nodded. "Deal." The next time she saw him, it was 2 weeks later. Different unit again. Back in the surgical ICU. The night had a brittle edge to it. Too many complicated post-ops. Too many tired residents with dark-circled eyes. The air felt charged, like the inside of a cloud right before lightning. She was adjusting a drip when that familiar weight pressed against her awareness. She looked up. Down the hall, In bed 6, through the glass, the visitor chair was occupied. Her heart jumped. He was there. Same cardigan. Same posture. But his head was angled slightly toward the glass this time, like he was already aware of her attention. She didn't let herself freeze. She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking fingers and typed a quick message. "He.S. here. Surg ICU. Bed 6. Send." Luis responded in under a minute. "On my way." She walked toward the room, trying to keep her pace normal. Not too fast. Not too slow. As she approached, the man in the chair stayed exactly where he was. No flicker. No dissolve. The patient in bed 6 was a woman in her 30s who had emergency surgery for internal bleeding that afternoon. Her chart read stable but guarded. Her vitals had been fine an hour ago. Aaron glanced at the monitor over the door. No alarms yet. No obvious fireworks. Heart rate slightly elevated but not concerning. Blood pressure, okay. Oxygen, good. She reached the doorway and paused. The man in the chair turned his head a fraction, just enough that she could feel his attention slide directly onto her. His eyes were that same pale, washed-out gray. His expression unreadable. Her hand tightened on the rail. She opened the door. The air in the room felt colder than it should have been, given the thermostat. The patient lay sleeping, chest rising and falling under the thin blanket. Her skin looked a little pale, but not dramatically so. The visitor chair was empty. Erin moved quickly. She checked the woman's SIV sites, her abdomen, her urine output. She pressed gently on her belly, watching for signs of rigid tenderness. The woman stirred and grimaced. "Hurts," she muttered. "Where?" Erin asked. "Everywhere," the woman whispered. "But here." Her hand moved feebly toward her side. "Feels tight." Erin's worry sharpened. She checked the surgical dressing more closely. No obvious fresh bleeding. But the woman's heart rate was a little higher now. Luis appeared in the doorway, his RT badge swinging. "Hey," he said, perfectly casual, as if this were just another routine check. "Heard she was a little dicey coming out of the OR. Thought I'd take a look at her breathing." He slipped in and put his stethoscope to the woman's chest while Erin took new vitals. The blood pressure reading came back 10 points lower than the last documented one. Recheck. Lower again. Luis met her eyes over the bed. She didn't have to say anything. They called the resident. By the time imaging was ordered, the woman's pressure was sliding. Her skin grew clammy. Pain creased her forehead even through the meds. They caught the rebleed quickly enough to get her back to surgery. The surgeon's face in the hallway was grim, but not hopeless. "Good thing you caught that drop," he said. "She'd have been in a lot worse shape if this had waited till shift change." Luis found her later, in the stairwell where she'd gone to breathe. "He was in the chair this time," she said. "He stayed long enough for me to see him and call you." "And she lived," Luis said. "For now," she said. He nodded. "We can control what happens after. We can only control how fast we move when we get the heads up." She leaned her head back against the cool concrete wall. "Do you think he knows?" she asked. "That we were trying to use him?" "That I am trying to use him," she corrected. Luis was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever he is, he's been doing this long before we showed up, long before this hospital existed. We were just the first ones stupid or desperate enough to stare back and say, 'Fine. If you were going to show up, I'm not going to waste it.'" He smiled at me, she said softly. "That night in Med ICU, right before the man almost died. It felt like he was amused. Maybe he just respects a nurse who pays attention, Louise said. She huffed out a weak laugh. That would be a first. The man in the visitor chair didn't go away. If anything, he became more present. Not more frequent, sometimes weeks went by without a glimpse, but more deliberate. When she saw him now, she felt less like she was catching a random overlap and more like she was being included in something. A grim partnership, maybe. He never pointed. He never spoke. He never did anything but sit there in that quiet, patient way. But she moved faster now. When she saw him, she checked the room, called providers, got labs drawn sooner, asked for imaging, called Luis. Sometimes people still crashed. Sometimes they still died. The ICU didn't turn into a place where everyone survived. That wasn't how the world worked. But sometimes someone lived who might not have. Sometimes a crash was averted. Sometimes a family got a little more time. On one particularly brutal night, months later, an internal medicine resident cornered her at the station. "How did you know?" he asked, eyes wide with exhausted confusion. About bed 4, there were no signs on the labs yet, no change in output, nothing. But you came to us and said, "Something's wrong. You need to see him now." And 5 minutes later, he is hypotensive and septic, and we re-throwing everything at him. How did you know? Aaron looked past him, down the hall, at the room where the man in the corner had been sitting so quietly half an hour before. The chair was empty now. She thought of trying to explain it. There's a man none of us admit to seeing who sits in chairs and waits for people to fall apart. There is something in this building that notices the cracks before we do. Sometimes he just watches. Sometimes I make sure I am watching too. Instead, she said the only thing she could. Call it a nurse's intuition, she said. We spend enough nights here, you start to feel when the floor is about to shift. The resident shook his head, half laughing. Whatever it is, keep doing it, he said, because I've never seen anyone call a crash that early before. Later that night, as she walked past bed 4, she glanced at the visitor chair in the corner. It was empty. But for just a second, in the glass, she thought she saw a reflection of a gray cardigan and a small, polite smile. Story 3. Room 404. They told her not to worry about room 404. Every hospital has one, the charge nurse had said with a shrug. A room people don to like. Ours just happens to be sealed. Maya hadn't thought much of it her first week on the San Antonio ICU. She was a travel nurse on a 13-week contract, still learning the layout of the unit, still figuring out which elevator jammed, which doctor liked to be paged versus texted, which ventilator made that faint rattling noise that drove respiratory crazy. The ICU sat on the 5th floor, but the rooms were numbered starting at 401. Something about the way the hospital had been expanded over the years, walls knocked down and rebuilt, spaces repurposed. It was a maze of angled hallways and little dead ends that made her think of an old shopping mall someone had tried to convert into something else. Room 404 sat near the end of the first hallway on the left. The door was solid, no glass panel like the others, and there was a faded sheet of laminated paper taped over the room number. Room closed. Do not use that first week. She barely glanced at it. She had more important things to focus on. The monitors, the med pump logic, the new charting system this hospital used that was somehow both more modern and more annoying than her last assignment. It was only in her second week when she finally felt like she could look up from the screens for 5 seconds without missing something crucial, that she started to notice the weirdness around 404. The first thing was the way people stepped around it. Most of the rooms had a loose traffic pattern. Night shift nurses drifted in and out, respiratory therapists wheeled carts, patient care techs shuffled in with vital sign machines and clean linens. People cut through wherever it made sense, but almost no one walked directly in front of 404. They skirted it, unconsciously adding 2 or 3 steps to their path to pass on the other side of the hallway. If they had to stand in that section of the corridor, they stood just a little farther away from the closed door than they needed to. It wasn't anything obvious. If you didn't look for it, you'd never see it. Maya noticed because she had the perspective of someone new. You see different things when you are not already woven into the habits of a place. On her 3rd week, in the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m., she was charting at the nurse's station when the unit clerk mumbled something under his breath. She glanced up. What? He didn't look away from the central monitor. Nothing. Just stupid glitch. The central monitoring system showed all the patient's vitals in little boxes, one for each room: 401, 402, 403, 405, and so on. For a second, just a flicker, 404 lit up. Maya saw it clearly. A blank box suddenly populated with numbers and waveforms, as if a patient had been assigned there without anyone bringing them up. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. Then it vanished. The square collapsed back into an empty space between 403 and 405. She frowned. Did you see that? The unit clerk, a guy named Ben who always looked like he needed 3 more hours of sleep, nodded. Yeah. Central pulled a phantom box again. It swears they fixed that. Phantom box? He stretched, joints popping. Sometimes 404 pretends it exists. Pops up, shows some garbage vitals, then disappears. They told us it has leftover programming from before they closed the room. Feeds that never got fully deleted. Whatever. Before they closed it, she repeated. Why did they close it? He hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Old story, he said. Ask one of the night shifters who has been here forever. They'll give you a more dramatic version. Dramatic how? She asked. He shrugged. Depends who you ask. Bad luck room, bad outcome, weird stuff. You know how nurses are. Give us a story, and we'll add 3 more layers to it. He tried to make it sound light, but he didn't look at 404's dark space on the screen again. That might have been the end of it, another piece of hospital trivia to file away with this attending hates phone calls, and the ice machine on 5 East never works if not for the footsteps. It was a Wednesday night, the kind that felt like it stretched twice as long as it actually did. Everyone was tired. The hospital air felt too dry. Maya's scrubs were clingy and uncomfortable under her isolation gown. Her assignment was the far corner. Rooms 410, 411, 4 and 12. Around 3:15 a.m., she stepped out of a room to grab a syringe from the supply cart in the hall. The unit was in that strange lull where everything was both fine and fragile. No one was crashing. No one was coding. But all the patients were balanced precariously on their wires and drips like tightrope walkers. You never truly relaxed. She was turning a vial in her hand, reading the fine print to double-check the dosage, when she heard it. Footsteps, soft, controlled, like someone in normal shoes rather than the squeaky hospital clogs everyone wore. They were coming from behind her, from down the hallway, the direction of the closed room. Okay, she thought. Visitor, doctor, security. Someone who didn't live in this world of foam clogs and hurried steps. She turned her head. The hallway was empty. Her eyes moved instinctively toward 404. The door was closed, the laminated paper still taped over the number. No light leaked from underneath the threshold. The little indicator above the frame, the one that showed whether a door was open or shut for the fire system, glowed the same dull green as always. The footsteps continued. They didn't echo exactly. The sound was muted, like someone walking in socks down an upstairs hallway. The pattern was clear, though. Heel, toe, rhythm steady, moving past where she stood, continuing down the corridor toward the nursing station. Maya's chest tightened. She watched the invisible path the sound took, the way her brain automatically tracked footsteps that weren't there. Her fingers tightened around the vial, knuckles whitening. 2 of the other nurses were at the station. Neither looked up. She waited for someone to appear at the corner. A resident. A respiratory therapist. Anyone. No one did. The sound stopped. She swallowed, suddenly aware of how loud the monitor alarm seemed, how cold the air felt against the back of her neck. "Did you hear that?" she called down the hall. Jamie, another night nurse, glanced back. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," Maya said. "Someone walking by." Jamie frowned. "No, just you talking to yourself?" Her attempt at humor sounded a little forced. Maya walked slowly toward the nurse's station, forcing herself not to look over her shoulder every other step. Her brain insisted that if she turned, she'd see someone walking just behind her. Almost, but not quite close enough to touch her shoulder. She didn't turn. By the time she reached the desk, her heartbeat had slowed enough to pretend nothing was wrong. "Do you ever hear things on this unit?" she asked, like she was making idle conversation. "Like stuff that sounds like it's coming from one of the rooms, but it's not." Jamie exchanged a quick glance with the charge nurse, a woman named Rosa, who had that particular brand of night shift energy that could either be comforting or terrifying depending on her mood. "What kind of things?" Rosa asked. "Footsteps," Maya said. Coming from, she gestured vaguely down the hall, unsure how much she wanted to admit. Rosa's gaze flicked briefly toward 404 as half-hidden door. "Ah," she said softly. "You got the 404, welcome." Ben made a noise under his breath. "Dante, start, Rosa." Maya folded her arms. "What does that mean?" Rosa leaned back in her chair, the overhead light catching the lines at the corners of her eyes. She'd been a nurse long enough to collect stories the way other people collected souvenirs. "You want the HR-approved version," she said, "or the version people whisper at 3 in the morning when we were losing our minds?" "Both," Maya said. Rosa smiled faintly. HR-approved. 404 was the scene of a really bad outcome a few years back. Complication no one caught in time. Family complained to administration, lawsuits, the whole thing. Hospital closed the room for renovation, then never reopened it. Some people think they don't like assigning that number because of the internet thing. "The error code," Ben added. 404 not found. Real comforting when it asks the number over your door. "And the other version?" Maya asked. Rosa's gaze drifted down the hallway and stayed there, on that closed door. "Other version," she said quietly, "is that the patient in that room didn't go easy, and the room never quite emptied out afterward." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Haunted room?" "I knew you wanted the dramatic version," Ben muttered. Rosa ignored him. "We used to use it like any other room," she went on. 5, 6 years ago. Then one night, we had a guy in there liver failure, septic, everything going wrong at once. He coded 3 times. 3rd time he didn't come back. That happens. We process it, we move on. But one of the new grads came running out of that room white as a sheet, saying she heard him calling her name after he was already gone. Voice from the bed, tubes out, monitors off, just calling. Maya felt a chill creep along her spine. People started noticing other stuff, Rosa said. Monitor leads jumping even when they were disconnected. Call light going off in 404 when nobody was assigned to it. Bed alarm tripping when it was empty. That kind of thing. And the footsteps? Maya asked. That came later, Rosa said, after they closed it. IT took 404 off the system, but Central would still get a box sometimes. Like you saw tonight. Just a glitch, Ben said quickly. He sounded like someone trying to convince himself. Rosa shrugged. Sure. And footsteps in an empty hall are probably the pipes. All I know is, if you stand too close to that door long enough, you'll hear someone moving around on the other side, like they were pacing. A monitor alarm chirped from one of Maya's rooms, sharp and insistent under the soft background beeping. She touched the pen in her pocket, a reflexive grounding gesture. Has anyone ever opened it? She asked. Facilities sealed it, Rosa said. Door lock disabled. Badge swipe doesn't work. They use it for storage now, supposedly. Old equipment, broken beds. You'd have to go through the main engineering office to get in, and they don't like being bothered. Ben tapped something on his keyboard. We did have one night where the door S indicator flipped to open, he said. Just for a second. Fire system thought it wasn't shut. Security did a sweep. Nobody in the room. Door still locked. They said it was a sensor issue. And you believe that? Maya asked. Ben didn't answer. She went back to her assignment, but the hallway felt different now. The dead space where 404 sat at the end of the row seemed to tug at her peripheral vision. Every time she stepped within 10 feet of that door, the hairs on her arms rose. The ICU had its own ambient soundtrack. Ventilators, infusion pumps, the occasional distant overhead announcement. In that little stretch of hallway, the sounds felt like they were coming from further away. Muffled, like she'd stepped into a slightly different building. She told herself she was being ridiculous. 5 days later, a code was called in 402. She ran toward the room with everyone else, the crash cart rattling behind them. The patient, a man in his early 60s with congestive heart failure, had dropped his pressure and then his rhythm, sliding into a dangerous, pulseless mess. They worked him, sweat and commands and compressions. The world narrowed to the rise and fall of her co-worker's hands on the chest, and the numbers blaring from the monitor. Adrenaline flooded the room, thick as a smell. At some point, in the middle of the controlled chaos, a sound broke through. 404 call light. The notification chimed overhead in the hallway. Maya looked up without meaning to. The call board at the nurse's station, visible through the gap in the doorway, showed a glowing button for 404. 404, calling, the tiny letters read. Leave it, Rosa snapped, not looking away from the code. It's a glitch. No one moved to answer it. You didn't walk away from a code to check on an empty room. They got the man in 402 back. Barely. He was transferred to another ICU afterward, one with more advanced cardiac support. When the room had been cleaned and the adrenaline faded, Maya found herself standing in front of 404. The door was as plain and unremarkable as ever. The laminated sign fluttered slightly in the hospital's air conditioning. The call light above it was dark. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm lightly against the door. The metal felt colder than the rest of the wall. On the other side, for a brief second, she thought she felt movement. Not sound, not anything she could point to if someone asked. Just a pressure, like someone standing with their back against the other side of the door, mirroring her. She pulled her hand back. "Okay," she murmured to herself. "That's enough sleep deprivation for tonight." She started to turn away. Something knocked. It was soft. 3 deliberate taps from the other side of the door. Not loud enough for the whole unit to hear, but close enough that she felt it through the soles of her shoes. She froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The instinct to run surged through her body like an electric shock. Instead, she stayed where she was. "Hello?" she whispered, hating the way her voice sounded. Silence. Behind her, a monitor alarm beeped. Someone laughed at the station. The ICU continued doing what it always did, keeping people alive a few hours or days longer than they might have had otherwise. She reached for the handle before she could talk herself out of it. It didn't turn. Of course it didn't. It was sealed. Facilities had locked it with something beyond the usual. There was no badge reader, no keypad, just a stiff, unmoving handle. She gave it another small tug anyway, then stepped back. For the rest of the night, she avoided that stretch of floor like everyone else. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined the knock, that it had been something falling in the storage space above, that the pressure she felt was just the way cold metal carried vibration. Then other people started hearing it too. It came up in the break room, the way these things always did. Someone mentioned a noise by the closed room. Someone else offered a story about a bad dream. Little threads popped up and knotted themselves into something larger. "I heard someone walking in there," one of the patient care techs said. "Like actual pacing. You know how the floors sound with those hospital socks?" "That? Impossible," one of the residents muttered. "It's full of junk. No one uses it." "Tell that to whoever was trying to get out," the tech shot back. She attempted a laugh, but it cracked at the edges. The older nurses were split. Half of them rolled their eyes and told everyone to stop feeding the spooky stories. The other half got very quiet when 404 was mentioned, their faces settling into an expression Maya recognized as fear disguised as annoyance. "You weren't here for the original mess," one of them told her in a low voice one night when they were alone at the Pyxis machine. "We had a guy in there crash in a way that didn't make sense. Everything we did, nothing worked. And when he finally went, the central kept showing a rhythm in that room for 12 minutes after he was pronounced." "Monitor artifact," Maya said automatically. "Maybe," the older nurse said. "Or maybe some rooms don't know when to let go." The thing about working nights in a place where people died was that you got used to compartmentalizing. You learned to put things in boxes. This was clinical. This was emotional. This was nonsense you didn't have time for. 404 refused to stay in any box. The more Maya tried to ignore it, the more it popped up on the edges of her shift. The call light for 404 started coming on more often. Not every night, not even every week, but enough that it became a running joke, the way people deal with things that unsettle them. 404 wants morphine, someone would say when the call board chimed and flashed its impossible request. "Tell 404 pain us not on his moyar," someone else would answer. No one ever answered the call. There was no reason to. Even if someone had wanted to open the door, They couldn't tee. And yet, each time it happened, Maya felt that same prickling unease at the back of her neck. If no one was in there, why did it keep acting like a patient? She started watching the timing. One night, just after a rapid response was called in 408, 404's call light turned on. Another shift, right after a patient in 401 started desaturating unexpectedly, the little light above 404's door glowed amber for a few seconds, then went dark. It began to feel less like random glitches and more like an echo. Something in 404 reacting to what was happening in the rest of the unit, or warning them. The thought came into her head uninvited one evening around 3:00 a.m. She was at the computer, reviewing lab results, when the call board chimed 404 calling. No one else was close enough to care. Rosa was down the hall. Ben was tangled up in a phone fight with the lab about a missing specimen. Maya looked at the board, then at the central. 404's box flickered on for half a second. She saw a heart rate, a blood pressure, a pulse ox. Then it vanished again. On the far side of the unit, a pump alarmed. A moment later, a monitor began shrieking. 411, pressure dropping, someone shouted. Everyone moved. Maya ran with them, adrenaline wiping out the last of her hesitation. The patient in 411, an older woman with a history of strokes, lay pale and clammy, blood pressure sliding, heart rate spiking. By the time the crisis was under control and the room had emptied out again, the call light for 404 was off. She stood in the doorway of 411, hand on the frame, and looked down the hall. The sealed room sat quietly, like any other piece of architecture. She had the sudden, absurd feeling that someone was watching her from just behind the door, waiting to see if she'd noticed. She went home that morning with a knot in her stomach she couldn't shake. It would have been easy to laugh it off, to blame it on sleep deprivation, on the way stress rewires your brain. She had friends who worked in normal jobs, who didn't spend their nights hovering over the line between life and death. When she tried to describe what the unit felt like at 3 a.m., they always tilted their heads, eyes widening slightly, like she was describing a foreign country. How could she explain it to them? She barely understood it herself. Weeks passed. Her contract halfway point came and went. 404 kept calling. Sometimes the knock came too. She started hearing it more clearly. 3 taps, sometimes 4, as if someone inside had gotten more impatient. It always happened when she was close enough to doubt whether anyone else could hear it. One night, she decided to test that. Jamie was stocking supplies in the hallway when 404's call light flickered on. "Come here a second," Maya said, keeping her voice low. Jamie walked over, eyebrow raised. "What is up?" "Stand here," Maya said, positioning her directly in front of 404. "Just listen for a minute." Jamie gave her a look that said, "You are wasting my time." But she humored her. They stood in silence. The ICU hummed around them, ventilators, distant voices, the occasional beep. Then, faint but distinct, there it was. Tap, tap, tap. Jamie's shoulders twitched. "You heard that?" Maya said. "Old buildings make noises," Jamie said quickly. "The vents, the pipes." "That wasn't the vents," Maya said. "That was someone knocking." Jamie's gaze flicked to the laminated sign and away again. "You were letting this place get in your head. Don T. let it. That's how you end up in the employee assistance office trying to explain why you were afraid of a line on the floor." She walked away faster than necessary. Maya stayed where she was. "Who are you?" she murmured, under her breath, to the door. No answer. She started to look up the old chart. It wasn't easy. The hospital's electronic system kept years of records, but you had to know what you were looking for. She searched by room. 404. Historical. The list of admissions that came up was long. People had been in that room before it was closed, obviously. Post-ops, sepsis, cardiac cases, trauma. But one chart had more flags than the others. More incident indicators, more notes. A middle-aged man, early 50s, admitted with a stomach bleed that turned out to be a malignant tumor. Treated. Complications? Infection. Things spiraled. The notes became more frantic. BP unstable. Increasing pressors. Family at bedside. Patient agitated, calling for help. He decoded multiple times. The final note read, time of death 0304. 304. Maya leaned back from the screen, heart sinking. She scrolled through the nursing documentation from that night. There, buried in the text, was a line that made her skin crawl. Patient repeatedly pressed call light, stating he could hear footsteps outside the room when no one was present. Requests staff not leave him alone. She swallowed. Outside the room. Now the footsteps were inside, and she was the one hearing them. Her next night on shift, she felt 404's presence before she even reached the unit. It was a busy night. The ED was slammed, and ICU beds were being filled as fast as they could clean them. A transfer from another hospital. A post-operative complication. A septic shock patient on 4 pressors. Maya got report, pulled meds, and dove into the chaos. For a few hours, 404 disappeared behind the more urgent reality of the bodies in front of her. Around 3:30 a.m., she stepped out of a room to strip off an isolation gown. Her scrubs underneath were damp with sweat. The hallway seemed strangely empty. The usual flow of night shift traffic had slowed. Behind her, the door to 404 creaked. She spun around. The handle didn't move. The door stayed shut. The indicator still showed closed. But the sound was unmistakable. That tiny grind of hinges that had been still too long. Tap. The knock came then. Not from the middle of the door, as before, but lower, closer to the floor. Softer. Like someone sitting on the ground inside, leaning back against the door, had lifted their hand and tapped lazily. She was so focused on the door that she almost missed the alarm. It started as a muffled beeping from 407. Another nurse called out for help. A moment later, the shriller tone of a serious alarm kicked in. "Desatting!" someone shouted. Maya tore her eyes away from 404 and ran. The patient in 407, a man who'd been relatively stable on a ventilator, was suddenly in distress. Oxygen saturation plummeting, blood pressure sliding, heart rhythm wobbling, everything narrowed to the familiar checklist in her head. Check tube, check connections, raise FiO2, call RT, call the doc. They stabilized him eventually. The crisis passed, leaving everyone pale and shaky. Much later, when she finally had a moment to breathe, Maya realized she'd never heard 404's call light that night. No chime, no glow, just the knock before the crash. The next day, she requested to talk to the night nursing supervisor. Not because she wanted to tell them about ghosts, because she wanted to know why the room was still on the board at all. If it's sealed and used for storage, she said, trying to keep her tone even. Why is it still showing up on Central sometimes? Why does it still have a call light? The supervisor, a man who'd been rotating between units for 20 years, rubbed his eyes. "Because this place is old," he said, "and patched together. They turned 404 into a storage room, but they didn't yank out all the wiring." The call circuits are tied into the rest of the hall. They'd have to take half the unit offline to fully remove it, and nobody wants that. So instead, Maya said slowly, "We have a room that keeps acting like it's occupied when it isn't DT." He shrugged. "I am more worried about the rooms that are occupied. Don T let the weird stuff distract you." She walked out, feeling scolded and unsatisfied. That night, she heard voices. They were faint. Not distinct words, just a low murmur, like someone talking in the next room with the door almost closed. She was restocking IV fluids at the far end of the hall when the sound started. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near 404. Her hand hovered over the saline bags. The hair at the back of her neck prickled. She moved closer. The murmur grew a little louder. It still wasn't too clear. It could have been one person talking, could have been two. Could have been someone on a phone. Could have been the TV in one of the rooms, except none of the TVs were on. She remembered the line in the old chart. Patient reports hearing footsteps outside the room. Was she hearing what he heard? Or was something new happening? She stopped less than a foot from 404's door. The laminated sign fluttered slightly in the air current she generated. The sound was definitely coming from the other side. It didn't sound like a patient begging. It didn't sound like a staff member reassuring. It wasn't a language she recognized exactly. It was like the shape of talking without the meaning. She swallowed. "Hello?" she whispered. The murmur cut off like someone had hit a switch. Silence dropped heavily in its place. The hallway felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. She stepped back quickly, telling herself she had a patient to see, meds to hang, real problems to deal with. The hospital couldn't afford to lose another nurse to burnout. And that's what this felt like. The edge of something that could push her over. On her next night off, she dreamed of 404. In the dream, the door was open. Light spilled into the hallway, too bright, like the harsh glare of an OR. She walked toward it, her shoes making no sound on the floor. Her body moved without her telling it to. Inside, the room was wrong. It was bigger than it should have been. Too long, like the bed had been stretched, like the walls had been pushed outward. The bed sat in the middle, rails down, sheets rumpled. There was someone in the bed. Not the man from the chart. Not anyone she recognized. Just the suggestion of a person under the blanket, chest rising and falling in restless rhythm. The monitors on the wall were blank. No numbers. No sound. In the corner, an IV stand stood with empty hooks. There was no one else in the room. No family. No staff. She stepped closer. The person in the bed turned their head. Their eyes were wrong. Not because of color or shape, but because they seemed to look past her, like she was the one who didn't belong. Their lips moved. She woke up before she could hear what they were trying to say. Her heart was pounding. Her sheets were damp with sweat. She stared at the ceiling, the afterimage of the open door burning in her mind. When she came back to work, she tried to keep her distance from 404. It didn't care. The call light kept chiming. The footsteps kept pacing. The knock kept coming, sometimes soft, sometimes loud enough to make her jump. No one else talked about it openly. At least not with management. But late in the night, when the unit quieted and people clustered around the station with coffee and charting, the stories grew teeth. One nurse swore she'd seen light under the door once, even though the room had no power. Another said she'd heard a monitor alarming behind the wall. Not the generic beep of a machine, but the specific, grating tone of a V-fib alarm. A respiratory therapist admitted, in a low voice with his eyes on the desk, that he'd walked past 404 and smelled something that reminded him of a fresh code blue sweat, alcohol wipes, the faint metal tang of blood. None of it made sense. Maya S.'s contract was almost up by the time things truly escalated. It was a Sunday night. Storms had rolled through the city all evening, rattling the windows and making the lights flicker. The hospital's backup systems had kicked in twice. Each time, there was that little half-second darkness that made everyone hold their breath. It swore the vital systems were protected. The ventilators, the pumps, the monitors, they all had redundancies. But the human brain didn't care about redundancy. It cared about that moment of nothing, the feeling of being briefly unmoored. Around 2:50 a.m., the power flickered for the third time. Maya was in a room, flushing a line. The lights went out. The monitor screens went black. For an instant, there was only the sound of rain on the windows and her own breath in her ears. Then everything snapped back on. Monitors rebooted. Pumps chimed in noisy protest. The ICU let out a collective sigh. She stepped into the hall. The central monitor at the nurses' station was full of red. Every box had alarm icons, complaints about lost leads and disconnections. In the middle of the chaos, 404 lit up. Not for a second this time, not a flicker. The box popped into existence and stayed. Heart rate, 118. Blood pressure, 98/63. Respiratory rate, 24. SpO2, 92. A steady green sinus rhythm marched across the strip. "Ben," she said. "Look." He looked. The color drained from his face. "Oh, come on," he whispered. "Not tonight." "Maybe it's tied into one of the other rooms," someone said. "They were all rebooting." "Check the feeds," Rosa ordered. Ben did. Fingers flying, he pulled up the technical screen that showed which monitors were assigned where. "Every room is mapped correctly," he said. 404 shouldn't be on here at all. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. The call light for 404 came on. Amber glow above the door, chime echoing down the corridor. 404 calling, the board read. Someone swore. "I am calling engineering," Rosa said. "They can come fix this themselves. I've got enough living patients to deal with." She picked up the phone with more force than necessary. Maya stared at the central monitor. The numbers were changing now. Heart rate creeping up. Blood pressure drifting down. Oxygen saturation dipping. She'd spent enough nights staring at real patients' vitals to recognize the pattern. Someone in trouble. Her brain did what it always did, detached and clinical. If that were a real patient, she thought, I'd be in the room already. But there was no room. Or rather, there was, and it was sealed. She felt the pull again, the urge she always had when she saw a bad strip or a dropping pressure. Check the patient. She started walking before she consciously decided to. "Where are you going?" Jamie called. "Just looking," she said. The hallway felt narrower now, like the walls were inching closer. The hum of the lights sounded too loud. She stopped a foot in front of 404. The laminated sign fluttered again. The call light above the door glowed steadily. She pressed her hand to the door. It was ice cold. On the central monitor, the heart rate hit 132. The knock came, sharp and insistent. Tap, tap, tap. "Let me in," Maya whispered without thinking, the words torn out of a place in her that had nothing to do with superstition, and everything to do with the part of her that couldn't tolerate a patient calling for help without answering. She grabbed the handle. This time, it moved. Not much. just a fraction of an inch, enough to show it wasn't as fixed as they'd been told. The indicator above the door blinked from green to yellow. The fire panel at the station chimed in protest. "Maya!" Rosa barked. "What are you doing?" Maya didn't answer. There was resistance behind the handle, like someone was bracing against it from the other side. For one wild second, she imagined hands, cooler than skin should be, pushing back. She put her shoulder into it. The metal groaned. Somewhere behind her, an alarm went off. The central monitor flashed. 404 leads off. Then 404 no signal. The door jerked in her grip. Then something gave way with a sickening crack, as if a rusted latch had torn free after too many years of pressure. The door opened, only a few inches, just enough to let out a gust of air that smelled like dust and something older, something sour and metallic underneath. The room beyond was dark. Her fingers tightened on the handle. For a heartbeat, it felt like everything on the unit stopped. No monitors, no voices, just the rushing sound of blood in her ears. Maya. Rosa was closer now, fury and fear braided together in her voice. "Step away from the door!" Maya took a small step back, but she didn't let go of the handle. Her eyes strained, trying to adjust to the darkness. She could just make out shapes inside. A bed, an IV pole, stacks of something, boxes, maybe, or broken equipment crowding one wall. And there, in the middle of the room, something that looked like an outline on the floor. A faint, discolored patch where the tile had been scrubbed too many times. The hair on her arms rose. A whisper brushed her ear. She couldn't tell if it was inside her head or coming from the crack in the door. It was softer than the murmur she'd heard before, shaped like words she couldn't quite catch. Please. Just that. One word. So quiet she wasn't sure she hadn't imagined it. Behind her, Rosa put a hand on her shoulder, fingers digging in. "That room is out of service," she said, low and firm. "You do not go into an out-of-service room without clearance from facilities. I am not doing a root cause analysis on why my travel nurse decided to break into a storage closet full of asbestos." Her attempt at sarcasm couldn't mask the tremor in her tone. Maya let go of the handle. The door drifted half-closed under its own weight. The call light above it blinked once and went out. On Central, 404 disappeared. The box collapsed into bare background, as if it had never been there at all. Engineering came up 10 minutes later, annoyed and half asleep. They checked the door. They checked the sensor. They checked the fire system. "Old hardware," one of them grunted. "Latch probably slipped. We'll reinforce it. As for the indicator, it's been finicky for years. We'll update the ticket." "What about Central?" Ben asked. 404 was live for a good 5 minutes. "Artifact," the engineer said. "You get noise on those lines sometimes. The system old. We re-upgrading next fiscal year." He said it with the conviction of someone who either believed every word or didn't he care if anyone else did. No one mentioned the knock. No one mentioned the voice. They didn't need to. It hung in the air anyway. Maya finished the rest of her shift in a haze. Every time she walked past 404, she resisted the urge to check the gap at the bottom of the door, to see if there was any sign that it had moved again. When she got home, she didn't sleep. She sat on her couch, staring at the empty wall across from her, the hospital still buzzing in her bones. It was absurd to feel guilty. She hadn't done anything. She hadn't gone inside. She'd done what she was supposed to do, kept the living patients alive, left the dead room alone. And yet, the memory of that whispered please gnawed at her. It sounded like every patient who'd ever hit the call light in the middle of the night because the world felt like it was closing in. Her contract ended 2 weeks later. They offered to extend her. She said no. Not because of 404 exactly. She told herself it was because she wanted to try another city, another hospital, that she needed a change. On her last night, the unit threw her a half-hearted little goodbye with donuts and lukewarm coffee. People hugged her, wished her well, joked about seeing her come back as staff one day. When things quieted, she found herself drifting down the first hallway one last time. 404 waited at the end of it. The laminated sign had been replaced. The new one was laminated a little more neatly, the tape edges sharp. Room closed. No entry. No call light glowed. No footsteps sounded. The door sat quietly under the fluorescent lights, a simple, ugly slab of painted metal. She stopped a few feet away. "Goodbye," she said, feeling ridiculous immediately. Something tapped, faintly. Once. It could have been the pipes, the vents, the shrinking and expanding of old building materials as they adjusted to the chill of the hospital air. It could have been nothing. She left the unit without looking back. Months later, on a travel assignment in another Texas city, she floated to a different ICU. New layout, new numbers on the doors, new faces, new stories. On her break, sitting in yet another generic hospital break room, she overheard a conversation between two nurses. "Have you worked nights long?" one asked. "Couple years," the other replied. "Long enough to know not to take the room at the end of the hall if they offer it." "Why?" The nurse shrugged, stirring powdered creamer into her coffee. "Bad things happen there," she said. "They closed it once, reopened it later. But I swear you can still hear stuff when you walk past. Alarms, footsteps, like someone S still in there even when it S empty." She laughed, light and a little shaky. "Every hospital has one," she added. "Ours just happens to be 214. Maya S. heartbeat picked up. Different number, different city. Same story, a sealed room, a bad death, echoes that wouldn't stop." That night, as she made her way through the unfamiliar ICU, she glanced at each door she passed. 210, 211, 212. The room was open here, curtain half drawn. A patient lay inside, connected to the usual tangle of lines and wires. A family member sat in the corner, head bowed over a phone. Nothing unusual. And yet, for a brief second, as she walked past, the call light for that room chimed. A soft noise, almost drowned by the others. Her skin prickled. In her mind, without meaning to, she saw 404's door again. The faint outline on the floor. The numbers on central. Some rooms, she thought, aren't just spaces. They accumulators. They hold on to things longer than they should. She didn't know if it was superstition or stress or something else entirely. She only knew that from then on, she paid attention. To the rooms hospitals tried to forget. To the numbers they sealed off. To the knocks that came when no one was supposed to be there. On certain nights, at certain hours, when the world narrowed to the glow of monitors and the smell of antiseptic, she could still hear it. A call light chiming for a room that no longer existed. A patient, somewhere in the dark, hitting a button that no one could answer. Room 404, not found. But not empty.